This week, I want to reference one of the things I wrote to you in our newsletter. Wrote a little bit about a scene in that 1980s John Hughes movie, Breakfast Club, where the students who are in all-day Saturday detention decide to leave the room they're supposed to stay in and go on some adventure through the school. And as they're doing that, the vice principal, who's monitoring them for the day, kind of gets wind of the noise and sees they're out there, and the kids are afraid they're going to get caught, so they start to argue what's the best and safest way to get back to the room they're supposed to be in. And they all have their ideas, and the guy who ends up having the right idea, they don't listen to. And they're about to get caught. And he says, well, go back that way, I'll distract him. And they didn't listen to that kid because he was the kid who was a little unsavory. He was the kid who took drugs and got in fights and did all that kind of stuff, very disrespectful. He had the right idea, but they didn't listen to him. And I think that's a trap we all fall into. Sometimes we don't listen to the right idea because of where it comes from or what we're expecting or who's giving it. Do you ever notice that at the start of a lot of disaster movies, there's a scientist being ignored by everybody else, who later in the movie turns out to be right and has to save the day anyway, right? This happens over and over. Some famous scientists who were completely ignored and made fun of. Gregor Mendel's law of inheritance, from which we developed our knowledge of heredity and genes and genealogy. He flunked out of school, and no one paid attention to the ideas he developed about heredity based on work in his garden. It wasn't until 16 years after he died that other scientists looking at his notes found out he was right and improved upon his ideas. Have you ever heard of Ignaz Semmelweis? No. Important person. He's the person who recommended first, kind of discovered the fact that if doctors washed their hands first, people died less. And he discovered this in a birthing clinic in a city. And he realized that women giving birth literally in the street had a lower mortality rate than women giving birth in the clinic. And he wondered if it was because the doctors attending the women in the clinic were coming from dealing with other patients who might have had communicable diseases, other infections, or just been dirty, and then they're using their hands to deliver a baby. And then the women would get sick of various infections and such and die. And he said, why are the women just giving birth themselves in the streets, dying in fewer numbers than the women coming to our clinic? And he suggested that the doctors wash their hands in between patients. They laughed him out of medicine. But he was right. Ludwig Boltzmann. Anybody know of Ludwig Boltzmann? Another forgotten guy who was right. He developed the theory that everything is made up of smaller pieces. He's the person who developed the theory of atoms. Again, laughed into non-recognition in his own time. Turns out later, when people figured that out, they realized he had said it first, and he was right. Among writers who write for TV and movies, there are certain what they call tropes, standard story themes that they use. And one of them is called the ignored expert. It's a scientist or expert who predicts a major disaster to happen but is not believed by his contemporaries. There's an entire research body of work on this. I found mine on tvtropes.org. Disaster movies, the expert is usually the lone voice of sanity, and sometimes when that expert gets ignored enough, you come up with the trope of the mad scientist. I'll show them. And then he uses his discovery to work for evil instead of good. There's also the trope of what they call the worm guy, the expert whose credentials aren't too clear but is getting everyone to follow them along anyway. The ignored expert goes way back in the history of religion too. Prophets, for example, in the Hebrew Bible, were not people who just made wild, blind predictions of the future. They were people who looked around them and said, you know, if this keeps continuing, we're going to be in big trouble. And they would say that, and the people would ignore them, and the big trouble would come in. And they say, should have listened to the prophet. This ignoring the expert trope plays out too often in our own world. Right now, we have all kinds of expert ignoring going on in our culture. Climate change is a hoax perpetrated by the Chinese. No. And we're in danger of taking the expertise away from groups of people who have historically had it in certain areas. The New York Times is fake news. The gold standard of journalistic reporting in our culture. But they're not an expert anymore. Don't listen to them. If this were a disaster movie, I wouldn't be feeling real good about the plot at this point. But it extends to lots of areas of life. Take education. I know we have teachers in our congregation. Are teachers the experts in education anymore? No. A lot of times it's politicians with little or no experience in actually teaching or running schools. Healthcare. Are doctors and nurses the experts in healthcare? No, politicians are arguing over who should pay for what and who's entitled to what, and is it a right or a privilege that you actually get a chance to be healthy? There was a time when ministers even were considered experts in their respective field. And now they're kind of like, yeah, whatever the minister says. We do our own thing. We are living in an age of de-expertizing people because we may not agree with their decision or their politics or what they look like or where they come from or what gender they are or what color they are. And it's leading us down a bad road. But there's lots of signs of hope too, because there are people who go from being the ignored expert into saving the day anyway. We had one at the beginning, or at the end of our last primary election cycle here in Massachusetts, when Ayanna Presley defeated Mike Capuano. The expert said Capuano was up 13 points and was going to win easily. But Ayanna Presley was the visionary. She knew that as good a job as Mike Capuano was doing, a lot of people in the district didn't buy into him. And she, being a woman of color with a past where she suffered abuse, made a direct connection to a lot of the people in the district who didn't bother to vote, and now they did. And she won easily. She was a bit visionary. And yet, as part of her visionary experience, one of the things she did was use old-fashioned techniques. She told her campaign, we're not going to buy any English language television time. And they had a big argument over this, but she didn't. Instead, she resorted to phone calling and knocking on doors and very effectively using social media to reach people who might not normally be involved. She was visionary. We have visionaries in our culture now saying, hey, wouldn't it be great if the United States joined the rest of the developed world and provided health care to all our citizens? Once visionary, now the common opinion of near 70% of the American public. We've heard this criticized as being socialism. Well, socialism got a bad rap in the 1950s as part of the Red Scare. Well, be careful of those communists, and socialism is just one sidestep away. But then, we've had a bigger and bigger discussion over the last couple of years of, hey, healthcare shouldn't cause you to go bankrupt. Healthcare shouldn't cause you death because you have a pre-existing condition. Should we take care of our people? And the term democratic socialism got attached to it and made it more palatable once people understood the democracy part. And people like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez in New York started using it openly after she won a big Democratic primary. So that vision starts expanding and expanding, and all of a sudden people who had the same visions, like Thomas Potter and John Murray, they start coming together. We had a visionary happening in Milford this past week that I was at. Eric Rodriguez, who's a pastor at the Way Church in Milford, invited some community activists to come talk to his church about registering to vote. And the room was full of this huge, diverse crowd. Lots of Latinos, some white folks, people of some different political persuasions. It was a great talk about how town government worked and how to get involved and how people pay attention when other people vote. And we heard from a guy named Keith Nelson. Can't hear me?
Microphone came up, please.
This one isn't on. I use this one. And this one, that one seems to be on? Yeah. Oh, sorry. I believe we're going to put a speaker up there and take care of the sound system, all right?
Right. So
Yeah. Help is on the way. We're going to put a monitor up there. It's in the works. We're going to move the soundboard down here. We're going to put a monitor up there. My apologies. So this guy named Keith Nelson from another church in Milford with a very diverse population stood up and told everybody of the experiences he had engaging town government. It wasn't very positive. And he said he felt dismissed as a Latino by the government in town, trying to get building permits, trying to get other things for his church, routine business. And he talked about how lots of Latinos were not feeling heard or seen, and why should we bother to get involved? No one wants to hear from us anyway. It was sobering to hear up close and personal. But in the room, there was vision, looking forward, coming up with ideas of how to get together, and people started talking to each other and meeting new people and fumbling with language they didn't understand. It was fascinating and wonderful. So we live in an age of de-expertizing. And I think we still have a lot of instances where male people and white people and Christian people want to de-expertise anyone else, even of their own experience. But that's changing. I think we all need to claim our expertise and seek our vision. When I was in college, I had a professor named Fritz Lander, from whom I got the Lander theorem of being the expert. Fritz was born and grew up in Holland under Nazi occupation. He had lots of stories to tell. And he taught a class about computer applications. This was 1988, 1989. I took a college class on how to use a word processor and a spreadsheet. It was great. Great time. Now, Fritz could write programs in like 8 different computer languages and was one of these expert guys. And so we called him the expert, and he just stumped me. He said, no, if you are working somewhere and the computer is new, and you took this class and you know about it, and you know more about it than anyone in your office or your school, guess what? You're the computer expert. From which I developed the Fritz Lander theorem of being an expert. If you're the person in the room who knows the most about whatever you're talking about, whether you want to be or not, you're now the expert. And I think we are all always the expert of our own experience, and we need to cede that opportunity to everyone else we meet, as different from us as they might be. We need to listen and not discount the experts who might really know something about what we're trying to work on or solve. And at the same time, we need to trust ourselves as being the expert of our own experience. And not discounting that is important to the conversation. And I think as we do this,